The television studio lights shone brightly as Representative Jasmine Crockett faced conservative commentator Ben Shapiro across the debate table. The CNN special town hall on criminal justice reform had already run for 40 minutes, with Shapiro delivering his trademark rapid-fire arguments against progressive reform proposals. Representative Crockett, Shapiro said, leaning forward with characteristic intensity, "Your proposed legislation completely ignores the statistical reality about recidivism rates and public safety. The data simply doesn't support your position." The audience grew silent, as Crockett, the former civil rights attorney now serving her second term in Congress, calmly opened a folder that nobody expected, containing detailed research from conservative-leaning institutions. For weeks, Shapiro had been citing these same sources to argue against the very reforms Crockett championed. "Mr. Shapiro," she replied, her voice measured but confident, "I've analyzed the complete data sets from the studies you've been referencing, not just the selected statistics. And they actually demonstrate the opposite of what you've claimed." Shapiro's expression shifted slightly as Crockett held up a graph extracted from a report he had cited in his own podcast just days earlier. What happened next didn't just challenge Shapiro's argument, it revealed a fundamental misinterpretation of data that would reshape the entire debate around criminal justice reform. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable exchange, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our latest political analyses. Before this pivotal moment in the CNN town hall, both Ben Shapiro and Representative Jasmine Crockett had traveled very different paths to become influential voices in America's ongoing debate about criminal justice reform. Ben Shapiro, at 39, had established himself as one of the most prominent conservative commentators in America. After graduating from Harvard Law School, Shapiro had built his reputation through his daily podcast, books, and speaking engagements, becoming known for his rapid-fire debate style and ability to cite statistics from memory. His platform, The Daily Wire, had grown into a conservative media empire reaching millions of Americans daily. Known for his "facts don't care about your feelings" approach, Shapiro had built his brand on challenging progressive policies with data-driven arguments. His critiques of criminal justice reform had been particularly pointed, with regular segments on his show questioning the effectiveness of rehabilitation programs and alternatives to incarceration. "The empirical evidence simply doesn't support the progressive approach to criminal justice," was one of Shapiro's consistent refrains, delivered in his characteristic, fast-paced, analytical style. In recent months, Shapiro had focused particularly on Crockett's proposed Criminal Justice Reform Act, characterizing it as dangerously naive and contradicted by every serious study of recidivism patterns. His appearance on CNN's town hall had been highly anticipated, with conservative supporters eager to see him dismantle progressive arguments in real time with his trademark statistical approach. In his opening statement, Shapiro had cited studies from institutions like the Rand Corporation and the National Institute of Justice, presenting their findings as definitive evidence against Crockett's reform proposals. In contrast, Representative Jasmine Crockett represented a newer generation in American politics, informed by direct experience with the criminal justice system. Before her election to Congress, Crockett had worked for years as a civil rights attorney in Texas, representing clients who had experienced the realities of the justice system firsthand. This practical experience had shaped her approach to policy, one grounded not just in academic studies but in the lived experiences of those affected by the system. Since joining Congress, Crockett had quickly established herself as a thoughtful voice on criminal justice issues, combining powerful advocacy with detailed policy analysis. Her proposed legislation, the Criminal Justice Reform Act, included provisions for expanded rehabilitation programs, sentencing reforms for non-violent offenses, and increased funding for re-entry support services. Behind the scenes, Crockett had been methodically preparing for this debate for weeks. While many representatives relied heavily on staff for such preparations, Crockett had personally reviewed the complete research studies that Shapiro frequently cited. Her legal background had given her the analytical skills to identify methodological limitations and contextual factors that were often overlooked in simplified presentations of complex research. The night before the town hall, she had spent hours reviewing the Rand Corporation's most recent longitudinal studies on recidivism and rehabilitation program effectiveness. The same studies Shapiro had referenced repeatedly but, as Crockett had discovered, often without acknowledging their full conclusions and contextual nuances. When CNN announced the town hall format, many political observers expected Shapiro would dominate the discussion. His debate experience and rapid-fire citation of statistics had proven challenging for previous opponents. Media coverage leading up to the event had emphasized the contrast between Shapiro's data-focused approach and what some commentators characterized as Crockett's more emotion-based advocacy. What these commentators didn't realize was that Crockett was bringing something unexpected to this encounter, a thorough understanding of the very research Shapiro relied upon, including methodological details, contextual factors, and conclusions that were often omitted in simplified presentations of complex studies. The town hall had begun with moderator Anderson Cooper introducing the participants and outlining the format. Shapiro's opening statement had been characteristic of his style: rapid delivery of statistics about crime rates, recidivism patterns, and what he described as the failed history of rehabilitation programs. "The data is clear," Shapiro had stated confidently. "The Rand Corporation's longitudinal studies show that 76% of offenders in traditional systems reoffend within 5 years. Representative Crockett's proposed alternatives have been tried repeatedly with similar discouraging results. We need to focus on what works, not what sounds compassionate but fails in practice." The audience, including both supporters and critics of criminal justice reform, had anticipated Crockett would respond with moral arguments about second chances and systemic inequities. Instead, they were about to witness something entirely different: a methodical, evidence-based challenge to Shapiro's interpretation of the very data he had cited with such confidence. The CNN studio hummed with anticipation as Representative Jasmine Crockett organized her materials following Shapiro's confident opening statement. The town hall setting, with its blue backdrop featuring the CNN logo and audience members seated in tiered rows, created an atmosphere of heightened attention. Bright television lights illuminated both participants as Cooper turned to Crockett for her response. "Representative Crockett, Mr. Shapiro has presented some stark statistics about recidivism rates that he suggests contradict your approach. How do you respond?" Cooper asked. Crockett nodded, acknowledging the question. "Thank you, Anderson, Mr. Shapiro's presentation was certainly confident, but there's a fundamental problem with how he's interpreting the research he's citing." She opened her folder deliberately. "Mr. Shapiro referenced the Rand Corporation's longitudinal studies on recidivism. I have those complete studies here, not just selected statistics. And what they actually demonstrate is quite different from what you've heard." This direct challenge to Shapiro's use of evidence, rather than simply offering an alternative moral framework, caused a subtle shift in the room. Shapiro straightened slightly, his expression attentive but still confident. "The 76% recidivism rate, Mr. Shapiro cited, comes from a control group in the study, specifically individuals who received no rehabilitation programming or re-entry support," Crockett explained, displaying the relevant page from the Rand report. The same study examined participants who received the type of comprehensive rehabilitation and re-entry support that my legislation proposes. She turned the page and held up a graph. For those participants, the 5-year recidivism rate was 43%, a reduction of 33 percentage points. That represents thousands of crimes prevented and lives improved. Shapiro leaned forward, prepared to respond. "Representative Crockett, I'm familiar with those findings. But what you're not mentioning is that those programs were extremely costly and produced marginal benefits when factors like severity of reoffending were considered." Crockett nodded. "I'm glad you raised the cost-benefit analysis, Mr. Shapiro, because the same Rand study addresses that directly." She flipped to another tabbed page. The study calculated that every dollar invested in these comprehensive programs returned $4.27 in reduced criminal justice costs and economic benefits. "This isn't my calculation, it's from the very source you cited." She looked directly at Shapiro. "So when you say the data doesn't support my approach, you're actually contradicting the full conclusions of your own source." This methodical dismantling of Shapiro's selective use of research created a pivotal moment. The audience, expecting ideological talking points, instead witnessed a substantive debate about research interpretation. Cooper recognized the significance and allowed the exchange to continue without interruption. Shapiro, adapting quickly, shifted approach. "Even accepting those cost-benefit calculations, Representative Crockett, you're overlooking a critical finding from the National Institute of Justice Studies that program effectiveness varies dramatically based on offender characteristics. The one-size-fits-all approach in your legislation ignores this crucial variability." Crockett was prepared for this pivot. That's an excellent point about program specificity, Mr. Shapiro. The NIJ research does indeed emphasize the importance of tailoring interventions. She retrieved another document from her folder. That's precisely why Section 204 of my legislation requires individualized assessment and appropriate program matching directly implementing the NIJ's recommendations. She displayed the relevant section of NIJ's recommendation. Her bill. The legislation doesn't create a one-size-fits-all approach as you've claimed. It actually mandates the kind of personalized programming that the research you're citing recommends. This revealed that Shapiro had either not read the actual legislation he was critiquing or had chosen to mischaracterize it. Either way, Crockett had exposed a significant weakness in his position. Shapiro, recognizing the need to shift ground again, moved to his next argument. The fundamental issue, Representative Crockett, is that these programs work in controlled studies but fail when implemented at scale. The Manhattan Institute's analysis of real-world implementations shows consistent failure when these academic models meet bureaucratic reality. Crockett nodded. Implementation challenges are real, and I appreciate you raising this concern. The Manhattan Institute report you're referencing examined programs that were underfunded and implemented without fidelity to the research models. She held up another document. However, the same institute published this follow-up analysis examining programs that maintained fidelity to the evidence-based models and received appropriate funding. Those programs showed success rates comparable to the controlled studies, she continued. That's why my legislation includes robust funding mechanisms and implementation oversight provisions in sections 301 through 315. Again, the bill directly addresses the very concern you've raised. This pattern continued for several minutes. Shapiro would offer a critique based on conservative research, and Crockett would demonstrate how either the full research contradicted his interpretation or her legislation already addressed the concern he raised. The dynamic shifted visibly as the exchange continued. Shapiro's normally rapid delivery slowed as he realized his usual approach of overwhelming opponents with quick citations was being methodically countered by someone who had done equal or greater preparation. Cooper, recognizing the substance of the debate, posed a question to both participants. Let's focus specifically on the cost issue. Mr. Shapiro has suggested in previous comments that the $8.2 billion in your bill is fiscally irresponsible. Representative Crockett, how do you respond to that concern? Crockett turned directly to Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro often cites the American Enterprise Institute in his economic analyses, so I'd like to reference their research on this topic. She held up an AEI report. Their cost-benefit analysis concluded that comprehensive criminal justice reform would save taxpayers $22.4 billion over 5 years in reduced incarceration costs. My legislation costs $8.2 billion over the same period. She looked at the audience. You don't need to be a Harvard-educated lawyer like Mr. Shapiro to understand that investing $8.2 billion to save $22.4 billion represents fiscal responsibility, not irresponsibility. This framing using conservative sources and fiscal responsibility arguments to support progressive policy visibly affected both the audience and Shapiro himself. The debate had moved from ideological territory to evidence interpretation, where Crockett's methodical approach was proving unexpectedly effective against Shapiro's usually dominant style. Shapiro, adapting his approach, attempted to shift the focus. The problem with your analysis, Representative Crockett, is that it assumes perfect implementation. Government programs routinely exceed budgets and underdeliver results. Your $8.2 billion will likely become $16 billion with half the projected benefits. Crockett was ready for this argument as well. Government effectiveness is indeed a legitimate concern. That's why I worked with Senator James Lankford, a conservative Republican with a strong record on government efficiency, to include robust accountability measures. She displayed a letter. Senator Lankford has publicly stated that the accountability provisions in this legislation represent the gold standard for program evaluation and fiscal responsibility. Again, that's not a progressive Democrat, but one of the Senate's most fiscally conservative members. This bipartisan endorsement of the legislation's fiscal responsibility measures further undermined Shapiro's critique, moving the debate from ideological assumptions to specific policy details. As the exchange continued, audience members could be seen nodding in response to Crockett's points. Even those who had arrived as Shapiro supporters appeared engaged by the substantive nature of the debate, which had transcended typical partisan talking points. Cooper, noting the time, moved to audience questions. A man identified as a police officer was selected to ask the first question. Mr. Shapiro frequently mentions concerns from law enforcement about these reforms. Representative Crockett, how do you respond to those public safety concerns? This question played directly to one of Shapiro's strongest rhetorical positions, his claim to represent the practical concerns of law enforcement against academic theories. The audience leaned forward, anticipating this might be a challenging area for Crockett. That's an excellent question, sir, and I appreciate your service, Crockett began. Law enforcement perspectives are crucial in this conversation. That's why I'm particularly proud that my legislation has been endorsed by the National Association of Police Organizations, representing over 241,000 officers nationwide. She held up the endorsement letter. Their president stated that this legislation would enhance public safety by reducing recidivism while providing officers with better options for addressing non-violent offenses. I didn't get this endorsement by ignoring law enforcement concerns, but by incorporating them directly into the legislation. This unexpected endorsement from a major law enforcement organization undermined another pillar of Shapiro's typical argument. The pattern had become clear on point after point. Crockett had anticipated his critiques and prepared specific, evidence-based responses that used his own preferred sources against him. Cooper turned to Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro, you've frequently cited public safety concerns. How do you respond to the law enforcement endorsements Representative Crockett has received? Shapiro, visibly recalibrating his approach, responded with more measured language than his opening statement. Organization endorsements are one thing, but many individual officers I've spoken with express serious reservations about aspects of this legislation. Their frontline experience gives them insights that may not be reflected in organizational positions. Crockett nodded. Individual perspectives are indeed valuable, which is why we conducted focus groups with over 300 officers from diverse departments during the drafting process. Their feedback led directly to modifications in the bill, particularly regarding the staged implementation approach for different offense categories. She continued. The focus group transcripts are public record, and they show that 28-day initial skepticism among many officers evolved into support once they understood the specific provisions rather than general concepts. This response, substantive, specific, and demonstrating thoroughness rather than ideological positioning, further reinforced Crockett's command of both the policy details and the supporting evidence. As the confrontation approached its climax, Cooper posed a final question to both participants. We've heard detailed discussion of research and endorsements, but ultimately this comes down to different philosophies about criminal justice. Mr. Shapiro, how would you characterize the fundamental difference in your approaches? This question gave Shapiro an opportunity to return to his philosophical strengths rather than continuing the evidence debate where Crockett had proven unexpectedly formidable. The fundamental difference, Shapiro began, is that Representative Crockett's approach prioritizes rehabilitation over accountability and public safety. While well-intentioned, this inverts the proper priorities of a criminal justice system, which must first ensure public safety before addressing offender needs. Cooper turned to Crockett. Representative, your response to that characterization? Crockett's reply would frame the remainder of the town hall and potentially reshape the public conversation about criminal justice reform. Crockett nodded thoughtfully at Shapiro's characterization before responding. I appreciate Mr. Shapiro framing our difference as philosophical rather than evidential, especially after our detailed discussion of the research. But I must respectfully challenge the false dichotomy he's presented between rehabilitation and public safety. She paused briefly, making eye contact with audience members. The research we've discussed today from the Rand Corporation, the National Institute of Justice, and even the Manhattan Institute all reaches the same conclusion. Effective rehabilitation directly enhances public safety by reducing recidivism. These aren't competing priorities, they're complementary strategies. This reframing, rejecting the either-or premise of Shapiro's characterization, represented a pivotal moment in the debate. Rather than accepting his philosophical framing, Crockett had identified a logical fallacy in his argument while maintaining focus on evidence-based analysis. What we're really discussing, she continued, isn't whether to prioritize public safety. We all agree on that goal. The question is, which approaches actually deliver public safety most effectively? And on that question, the The evidence consistently shows that rehabilitation programs, when properly implemented, reduce crime more effectively than simply warehousing offenders. She held up a final document. This meta-analysis examined 58 studies comparing rehabilitation-focused approaches with traditional incarceration. The findings were clear. Jurisdictions implementing comprehensive rehabilitation programs experienced crime rate reductions, 23% greater than those relying primarily on incarceration alone. Turning directly to Shapiro, she added, "This isn't about choosing between accountability and rehabilitation. My legislation maintains serious consequences for criminal behavior while implementing programs proven to reduce future offenses. That's not being soft on crime, it's being smart about preventing it." The audience responded with the first spontaneous applause of the evening, recognizing the clarity and strength of this reframing. Shapiro, who had built his reputation on identifying logical fallacies in opponents' arguments, found himself in the unusual position of having his own false dichotomy exposed. Cooper, noting the response, turned back to Shapiro. "Mr. Shapiro, how do you respond to Representative Crockett's point that rehabilitation and public safety aren't competing priorities but complementary approaches?" Shapiro, recognizing the need to adjust his purported "that it out so" position, responded with a more nuanced approach than his earlier statements. "I appreciate Representative Crockett's thoughtful response. I agree that rehabilitation and public safety aren't inherently opposed. My concern is about proper sequencing and emphasis." This concession that the two goals weren't fundamentally opposed represented a significant shift from his initial characterization. The audience, which included many familiar with Shapiro's usual debating style, recognized this adjustment as unusual for someone known for holding firm to his initial positions. However, Shapiro continued, attempting to regain ground, "I still maintain that the specific provisions in the legislation place too much emphasis on offender needs relative to victim rights and community safety." Crockett responded directly to this more specific critique. "Again, I appreciate the substantive engagement, Mr. Shapiro. Victim rights are indeed crucial, which is why Title IV of the legislation expands victim services and restitution programs by $1.3 billion. The bill actually increases victim support funding by 40% over current levels," she continued. "Additionally, community safety is addressed through the graduated release provisions, which require demonstrated behavioral change and risk assessment before any modification to sentences. The legislation was specifically designed to balance multiple priorities: offender rehabilitation, victim support, and community safety, rather than privileging one over others." This detailed response to Shapiro's adjusted critique further demonstrated Crockett's command of the legislation's specifics and her ability to address substantive concerns rather than simply trading ideological positions. As the town hall continued into audience questions, the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. What began as an expected clash between conservative facts and logic and progressive compassion and idealism had transformed into a substantive policy discussion where Crockett's evidence-based approach had repeatedly demonstrated the limitations of Shapiro's selective use of research. A conservative audience member, identifying himself as a prosecutor, asked a pointed question. "Representative Crockett, I've seen rehabilitation programs fail in practice despite promising studies. Why should we invest billions more in approaches with such mixed real-world results?" This question, directly challenging the practical effectiveness of Crockett's approach, provided another opportunity for substantive engagement rather than ideological positioning. "That's an excellent question based on real experience," Crockett responded. "Program failure is a legitimate concern that any responsible legislation must address. The critical factor in success versus failure is implementation fidelity, whether programs in practice actually follow the evidence-based models that proved effective in research," she continued. "That's why sections 401 through 417 of my legislation establish implementation standards, training requirements, and oversight mechanisms specifically designed to ensure fidelity to the evidence-based models. We've learned from past failures that good ideas poorly implemented don't work. This legislation incorporates those lessons directly." This response, acknowledging legitimate concerns while explaining specific provisions designed to address them further, reinforced Crockett's approach of engaging substantively rather than dismissing critiques. As the town hall approached its conclusion, Cooper posed a final question to both participants. "After this substantive discussion, is there any common ground you've identified that might form the basis for bipartisan progress on criminal justice reform?" This question provided an opportunity for both participants to move beyond confrontation toward potential consensus, a shift that would be particularly significant given the initially oppositional framing of the town hall. Shapiro, demonstrating the intellectual flexibility that had contributed to his rise as a conservative commentator, responded first. Despite our different perspectives, Representative Crockett and I clearly agree that policy should be driven by evidence rather than ideology. I've been impressed by her detailed knowledge of the research and her willingness to incorporate accountability measures and implementation safeguards into the legislation. This acknowledgement that Crockett's approach was evidence-based rather than purely ideological represented a significant vindication of her preparation and substance. Shapiro continued, "While I still have reservations about specific provisions, I believe the graduated implementation approach, allowing for assessment and adjustment, represents a responsible way to test these ideas. That structured, evidence-based approach to policy implementation is something conservatives and progressives should both support. This identification of specific common ground, the emphasis on evidence and structured implementation represented a notable shift from the town hall's initial framing as a fundamental clash of incompatible worldviews." Crockett responded with equal thoughtfulness. "I appreciate Mr. Shapiro identifying that common ground. I believe we also share a commitment to fiscal responsibility and measurable outcomes. Conservative and progressive goals in criminal justice aren't always as opposed as our political discourse suggests. We all want safe communities, reduced taxpayer burdens, and systems that reflect our values of justice and opportunity," she added. "The provisions requiring regular assessment and demonstrated effectiveness before full implementation reflect exactly the kind of responsible, evidence-based approach that should appeal across ideological lines. If a program doesn't work, we should change or end it. That's a principle I believe Mr. Shapiro and I both support." This emphasis on accountability, measurement, and fiscal responsibility, framed in terms that acknowledged conservative priorities, further demonstrated Crockett's ability to engage beyond ideological boundaries while maintaining her core policy positions. As Cooper wrapped up the town hall, the audience response reflected the substantive nature of the discussion. Rather than partisan cheering for their side, attendees across the political spectrum applauded the depth and substance of the exchange. One audience member was overheard telling another, "I came expecting a shouting match but got an actual policy discussion. When was the last time you saw that on television?" This sentiment appreciation for substantive engagement rather than performative confrontation captured the unexpected impact of the town hall. What had been promoted as a clash of incompatible worldviews had evolved into a model of how evidence-based policy discussion could transcend partisan positioning. In his closing remarks, Cooper acknowledged this unusual dynamic. Tonight's discussion demonstrated that substantive policy debate is still possible in our polarized environment. When participants engage with evidence and specific proposals rather than broad generalizations, we can move beyond talking points to meaningful evaluation of complex issues. As participants gathered their materials after the town hall concluded, Shapiro approached Crockett. "Representative, I appreciate your thorough preparation and substantive engagement tonight. Your command of the research, including sources from across the ideological spectrum, was impressive." This professional acknowledgement from a commentator known for rarely conceding ground to ideological opponents represented perhaps the clearest indication of how Crockett's approach had shifted the expected dynamic of the confrontation. Crockett responded with equal professionalism. "Thank you, Mr. Shapiro. I've always believed that engaging with the strongest version of opposing arguments leads to better policy. I appreciated your willingness to move beyond initial positions to discuss specific evidence and provisions. This mutual recognition of substantive engagement, transcending the expected partisan performance, captured the rare nature of what had transpired." As they left the stage, a CNN producer was overheard telling a colleague, "That wasn't the fireworks we expected, but it was something better, a demonstration that policy debates can still have substance when participants do their homework and engage with evidence rather than just talking points." The town hall had demonstrated how congressional oversight and public debate could serve their highest purpose, not as venues for partisan performance but as forums for substantive policy development that clarified rather than obscured the trade-offs and evidence relevant to important public decisions. The aftermath of the remarkable town hall between Representative Jasmine Crockett and Ben Shapiro extended far beyond the immediate television audience, creating significant ripples through political, media, and policy circles. Within hours, clips from their exchange had spread across social media platforms, generating millions of views. Unlike typical viral political content that features emotional confrontations or gotcha moments, these clips highlighted substantive exchanges about research interpretation and policy design. A 15-minute compilation titled Evidence-Based Policy Debate trended on Twitter, with commentators across the political spectrum noting the unusual depth of the discussion. Media analysis quickly identified the town hall as representing something different in contemporary political discourse. The Atlantic published an article headlined, "When Substance Trumps Style, the Crockett-Shapiro Criminal Justice Debate," noting, "In an era where political exchanges often generate more heat than light, last night's discussion demonstrated what everyone and they too have seven-act happens when both participants come armed with evidence, rather than merely talking points." Even conservative outlets acknowledged the substantive nature of the exchange. National Review's analysis observed, while conservatives may disagree with Representative Crockett's policy conclusions, her methodical engagement with research, including studies from conservative institutions, represents the kind of substantive debate that should be encouraged across the political spectrum. For Crockett, the aftermath brought new recognition beyond partisan contexts. The Washington Post profile that followed characterized her as the Congresswoman redefining evidence-based policy, noting her unusual approach of engaging directly with research across the ideological spectrum rather than relying solely on sources that aligned with her policy preferences. In media appearances following the town hall, Crockett emphasized the importance of substantive engagement rather than claiming personal victory. On Morning Joe, when asked about defeating Shapiro, she redirected, "This isn't about winning debates, but about developing effective policy. What happened in that town hall is what should happen more often: detailed discussion of evidence and specific provisions rather than broad ideological claims." This focus on substance over personality reinforced her emerging reputation as a serious policy voice rather than merely an effective partisan combatant. Perhaps most significantly, Shapiro himself addressed the town hall on his daily podcast, offering an assessment that surprised many of his listeners. "Representative Crockett came better prepared than virtually any political opponent I've encountered," he acknowledged. "While I maintain my concerns about aspects of her legislation, her command of the research, including conservative sources, and her ability to address specific implementation questions rather than merely asserting broad principles, was impressive and commendable." He continued, "This exchange reminded me that effective policy debate requires engaging with the strongest version of opposing arguments rather than the weakest." Conservatives should learn from Crockett's approach of addressing substantive concerns directly rather than dismissing them with broad ideological assertions. This acknowledgement from such a prominent conservative voice, effectively crediting Crockett with raising the standard of policy debate, represented an extraordinary validation of her approach and substance. The town hall's impact extended to practical policymaking as well. 3 weeks after the exchange, Crockett announced that several Republican senators had approached her about potential modifications to her legislation that could garner bipartisan support. The changes maintained the core rehabilitation provisions while strengthening accountability measures and implementation safeguards, precisely the areas where Shapiro had raised legitimate concerns. Senator Tim Scott, a conservative Republican who joined Crockett at the press conference announcing the bipartisan framework, explicitly referenced the town hall. Representative Crockett's substantive engagement with research from across the ideological spectrum and her willingness to incorporate accountability measures that address legitimate conservative concerns created space for meaningful bipartisan work on this important issue. This practical policy impact, moving beyond partisan positioning to actual legislative progress, demonstrated how substantive debate could influence governance beyond political messaging. In Congress itself, the town hall established new expectations for policy engagement. Committee chairs began requesting that members engage with research and specific policy design questions rather than broad ideological positioning. Several representatives were observed citing specific studies during subsequent hearings, suggesting a heightened emphasis on evidence rather than purely philosophical arguments. Law schools and public policy programs reported using videos of the exchange in courses on effective policy development and communication. A professor at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy explained, The Crockett-Shapiro Town Hall demonstrates what public policy debate should look like, engaging with evidence across the ideological spectrum, addressing implementation challenges directly, and focusing on specific provisions rather than broad generalizations. 6 months after the town hall, the American Political Science Association published a detailed analysis of the exchange titled Evidence-Based Argumentation in Political Discourse. The study concluded, Representative Crockett's approach engaging substantively with research from ideologically diverse sources, addressing implementation concerns directly, and focusing on specific provisions rather than broad principles, offers a potential model for elevating political discourse beyond partisan positioning. For Crockett personally, the town hall transformed her position in Congress and national politics. No longer viewed simply as a rising progressive voice, she became recognized as a policy expert capable of engaging substantively across ideological lines while maintaining her core principles. In a profile 1 year after the town hall, Politico dubbed her the evidence-based progressive, noting, "In an era where political arguments often involve each side citing only research that confirms existing beliefs, Representative Crockett has pioneered a different approach, engaging seriously with research from across the ideological spectrum and addressing substantive concerns rather than dismissing them as bad faith." Shapiro, when asked about Crockett in a subsequent interview, offered perhaps the most significant endorsement. "In my years of political debate, I've encountered many opponents who could deliver passionate arguments for their positions. What distinguished Representative Crockett was her commitment to engaging with the strongest version of opposing arguments rather than the weakest. She didn't just know her own talking points, she understood the research her opponents cited often better than they did themselves." This acknowledgement that Crockett had engaged with conservative arguments at their strongest rather than their weakest represented an unusually generous assessment from a commentator known for highlighting the weaknesses in progressive positions. Policy development courses began featuring the exchange as an example of effective evidence-based advocacy. A professor at Harvard's Kennedy School explained, "We teach students to understand research from multiple perspectives, consider implementation challenges seriously, and engage with legitimate concerns rather than dismissing them." The Crockett-Shapiro exchange provides a real-world example of this approach, succeeding in a high-profile political context. Perhaps most importantly, the town hall influenced how subsequent policy debates were conducted across multiple issues. Rather than purely ideological confrontations, discussions increasingly featured engagement with research from diverse sources, consideration of implementation challenges, and focus on specific provisions rather than broad principles. A senior congressional staff member involved in policy development observed, "Before the Crockett-Shapiro exchange, many policy debates involved each side citing only research that supported their predetermined positions. Now we're seeing more willingness to engage with research across the ideological spectrum and to address implementation concerns directly rather than dismissing them as bad faith objections." This shift in debate, approach from selective citation to comprehensive engagement, represented the town hall's most significant legacy, demonstrating how substantive policy dialogue could elevate political discourse beyond partisan positioning. As one political scientist noted in an analysis on the exchange's anniversary, what made this exchange historic wasn't just the participants or the setting, but its demonstration that evidence-based policy debate remains possible in our polarized environment. By engaging with research comprehensively rather than selectively, addressing implementation challenges directly, and focusing on specific provisions rather than broad principles, Representative Crockett and, eventually, Mr. Shapiro showed how political discourse can inform rather than merely inflame. The exchange entered the canon of significant political moments, not as an example of partisan domination, but as a demonstration of how evidence-based engagement could elevate policy debate beyond the limitations of contemporary political discourse. For students of policy development, political communication, and democratic deliberation, the Crockett-Shapiro Town Hall became a case study in how public officials could transcend partisan positioning to engage with fundamental policy questions, testing positions against comprehensive evidence, acknowledging legitimate concerns from opposing perspectives, and working towards solutions that addressed substantive challenges rather than merely satisfying ideological preferences. As one political commentator concluded in an assessment of the exchange's impact, in an era often defined by political performance rather than substance, The Crockett-Shapiro town hall offered a different model, one where preparation trumped performance, comprehensive evidence, engagement replaced selective citation, and addressing legitimate concerns took precedence over dismissing them. The result wasn't just a more substantive exchange, but, ultimately, more effective policy development. The criminal justice reform legislation itself, modified through the bipartisan process that followed the town hall, eventually passed with support from lawmakers across the partisan ideological spectrum. Its implementation included robust evaluation provisions, ensuring that evidence would continue to guide adjustments and improvements over time. At the bill signing ceremony, a conservative senator who had initially opposed the legislation before supporting the bipartisan version explicitly referenced the town hall. Representative Crockett's willingness to engage with concerns about implementation and accountability, demonstrated so clearly in her exchange with Ben Shapiro, created space for cooperation that would have been impossible in a purely ideological confrontation. This legislation is stronger because it incorporates perspectives from across the political spectrum. This tangible policy outcome legislation improved through substantive engagement across ideological lines, represented perhaps the most meaningful legacy of an exchange that began as expected political theater but evolved into something much more valuable. A model for how evidence-based policy development could function in a democracy too often limited by partisan positioning. If you found this analysis of substantive policy debate valuable, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We'll continue bringing you in-depth coverage of the most significant political exchanges that elevate discourse beyond partisan talking points. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming analysis of how evidence-based engagement is reshaping debates across multiple policy areas.